I had heard over and over that part of the gender wage gap was because women don't ask. Women are worse negotiators than men. And I'd heard it so much, I assumed it had to be true. And so I wanted to do a study on gender and negotiation, but I just was going to start by doing my lit review to kind of show what else was out there. And when I did that lit review to try to summarize the research, I found that there was no research that showed that men were better negotiators than women. There was research showing that men negotiated more, and there was research showing that people rated men as better negotiators, but no research showing that they actually were better. And so then I designed my own study.
Hi, Dr. Low. Thank you so much for joining me on the Morning Waltz podcast. I'm so excited to chat with you, and I'd love to dive in and just have you give a brief introduction of yourself.
Great. Well, I'm so excited to be here. I'm Dr. Corinne Low. I am an economist and professor at the Wharton School, and I'm the author of the new book, Having It All, What Data Tells Us About Women's Lives and Getting the Most Out of Yours. And I hope I'll be sharing some of the insights from that with your listeners today.
Well, I know you're going to, so I would love to understand for listeners who don't know you or are not familiar with your work, how would you describe the focus of the work that you do and what motivates it?
So, I am an economist who has studied women's lives, the economics of being a woman, meaning career family trade offs, meaning fertility and reproduction, meaning discrimination in the workplace for my entire career. And all of those insights are in the book, but I also try to bring to the table insights just from the field of economics, the discipline from economics, as a framework for how we can kind of claw back more of our time and our joy in an environment where, as I described, we're getting squeezed from all sides.
Right. Well, can you take it back to the beginning? How did you get here?
I say in the book, in 2017, I gave birth to my son and also a midlife crisis because I really believed that I was going to be an equal to my male colleagues at the office, and that I was going to be able to be equal in my home and kind of share things equally. And what I found was that I was falling behind my male colleagues. I was busy and exhausted all the time. I, in that case, had a 2.5 hour commute to my job. And I found myself pumping in the Amtrak bathroom, crying because I was going to miss my son's bedtime. And I just thought, how did I get here? And how do I feel like I am the primary caretaker, the default parent, but I'm also the primary breadwinner? And that was what led me to start studying women's time, to see that I was not alone, that this was a phenomenon that was affecting women everywhere.
Yeah. What probably surprised you the most?
What surprised me the most was that the inequality, when I looked at time use, I knew that kind of women were doing more, but that the inequality was larger in cooking and cleaning than it was in childcare.
Mm.
Because I felt like childcare kind of makes sense. I was like, I'm the one who's pregnant, I'm the one who's breastfeeding, I'm the one who takes maternity leave. So I get how you could fall into that dynamic. But I joke in the book that, like, I don't sweep the floor with my uterus. Like, there's no reason that I need to be the one doing the majority of the laundry or the majority of the meal prep. But women were doing so much more. And not only just because they're maybe working less or they're earning less, but even when they were the primary breadwinner, which was my case, right? Even women who are the breadwinner in their household, they still do almost twice as much cooking and cleaning as their lower earning male partners.
Oh my gosh. I don't know if you're seeing the circulation of that show that Dakota Fanning is in.
I haven't watched it yet, so no spoilers, but I need to watch it.
I have not watched it yet either, but there's that one very specific clip that's
Yeah.
circulating about how she's sitting in her car and she's talking to her partner, and he's talking about, time off, and she's like, "Well, your time off is you
Yep.
go play
Yep.
basketball with your friends. Mine is going grocery shopping," and all of that. You mentioned in terms of the research being equal to the male colleagues in your industry. Do you mind me asking, at the time that you started the research in this, was this putting a strain on your personal relationship?
100%. And then the story is, I mean, I ended up getting divorced, and I don't think it was the research that was, that put the strain in my relationship. It was the reality, right? It was the reality that I saw that COVID really brought it into sharp relief because I saw that for my male colleagues, because they were professors at Wharton, the expectation was no matter what their wives were doing, they were going to be the ones to absorb this shock, right? They were going to be the ones who was going to be on Zoom school with their kids, right? Um, but I was also a professor at Wharton. And even though my ex husband was not working, he was starting a business, but he wasn't getting paid, right? Um, his expectation was that we were going to split it 50-50. But in this case, 50-50 was not equitable because my career was the one that not only paid our bills, but it was also at this critical point being pre tenure, where if I got tenure at Wharton, that was going to mean higher income for us as a family, for the rest of my career. And so I really saw that inequality of just because I was a woman, right? That I didn't get the benefit of the doubt that, my career should be a priority.
Mm.
So yes, it was very challenging and I had to really reevaluate things. And I don't think that everybody needs to, get divorced, right? That was after a lot of trying to make it work and trying to reallocate things. But I do think that everybody needs to be in a relationship that's equitable. And that
Mhm.
doesn't have to be 50-50. That doesn't have to be you do the exact same things, but it has to be that each of your needs are getting met. It has to be that you're each able to pursue self actualization and self fulfillment. You're able to pursue your career goals and you're able to get time for yourself, not time off grocery shopping, as Dakota Fanning is saying, but time to actually pursue the things that fill your cup. And if you aren't getting that, it's never too late to renegotiate the deal that you're in.
Yeah. Well, you talk a lot about negotiation and
Yeah.
using data to negotiate. I would love to understand that a little bit more and what the data says about women and negotiation.
Yeah, this is one of those stats I just love sharing because it's such a misconception that it was a misconception I had as well that I had heard over and over that part of the gender wage gap was because women don't ask. Women are worse negotiators than men. And I'd heard it so much, I assumed it had to be true. And so I wanted to do a study on gender and negotiation, but I just was going to start by doing my lit review to kind of show what else was out there. And when I did that lit review to try to summarize the research, I found that there was no research that showed that men were better negotiators than women.
Mm.
There was research showing that men negotiated more, and there was research showing that people rated men as better negotiators, but no research showing that they actually were better. And so then I designed my own study where men and women negotiated over a $20 bill. But the catch was that you could split it either $15 for you, $5 for the other person, or vice versa, 15 for them, $5 for you. And if you couldn't agree on one of those two splits, then you would get nothing. And that's a common feature of negotiation because if you're doing a business negotiation and you don't agree, then it doesn't happen. You don't get the profits from that.
Mhm.
And what I found is that when men and women negotiate against each other, they each had an equal chance of getting the $15. So equal skills in negotiation. They were equally as likely to get the $15. But women, on average in that study, did better. They walked away with more money in their pocket. Why? Because when women negotiated against other women, they also did just fine. But when men negotiate against other men, they were more than twice as likely to fail to reach that agreement and therefore walk away with $0. And that cost them money. So the men got less because when they were negotiating against other men, they were failing to actually reach an agreement. And so if I'm a manager, I'm actually more worried about the person who's going to blow up a multi-year, multi-million dollar partnership because they can't get the extra 0.0005% on the royalty contract, right? Just trying to pursue the better deal for yourself is not always, quote, good negotiating. And here we could measure that in dollars and cents. And so I want us to stop telling women they need to act more like men in the workplace because the evidence doesn't show that men are all that great.
Yeah. So professionally, I do corporate recruiting. And it's interesting, though one of the conversations I always have is around negotiating compensation and the entire package. So I always am very this always piques my interest of how men and women show up in a negotiation. So that's very, very fascinating. How do you think that post-pandemic, what shift had you seen and what does that look like now in the research that you've done?
Well, we are in a period. a tough period that I don't think is just post pandemic. It's a lot of things that are happening. It's that some people in this country are questioning whether women should be in the workplace at all, right?
Yeah.
So we're in a tough period. And what we see in the data is women leaving the workplace. We see that the gender wage gap has grown for the past 2 years. It had already stagnated in the rate that it was closing, but it has grown in the past 2 years. And it really disappoints me because I think that investing in making workplaces work for women is not just good for women, it's good for profit, it's good for the bottom line, it's good for getting the best talent, it's good for meritocracy, it's good for innovation.
Mhm.
But one of the places that I really try to push back is that a lot of firms are saying, well, women are leaving because we did return to office and women don't want to work in the office. So there's nothing that we can do. And where I push back is I say, wait a minute, nursing is a fundamentally in person job. It's also fundamentally inflexible. And yet it's almost 90% female.
Mm.
The reason it works for women is that it is structured and predictable. So women don't necessarily want flexibility, they want boundaries. And I think our workplaces can do better in offering those boundaries. And so if you say it's return to office, but it's return to office with a hard stop at 5 so you can pick up your kids, I actually think that's going to work for a lot of women. And so I think that it is a lack of creativity and it's really poor management that's causing women to leave the workforce. And that's a different narrative.
Yeah. It really is, and I think that it sounds like with a lot of the research that you do, you're shedding some blind spots on these areas, especially management. Um, have you started to see kind of a shift in that thinking? I should say, you're a perfect example of, nursing. I feel we take a couple steps forward and then all of a sudden we spring 10 feet
Yeah.
back. So yeah, those blind spots. I mean, how do we move forward and keep that momentum going?
Well, I think that the good news is, to the contrary of all this musing of should women really be in the workforce, right? America and American families rely on women's income, right?
Mhm.
So I don't think that we're ever putting that genie back in the bottle. And that means that I think that there are female managers and there are female legislators, right, where we command enough of the economic and social and political power that I do think we can keep pushing things forward. So that resistance to the change has gotten stronger right now, but that doesn't mean that we can't push through it because we have all of the strength that we've accumulated from the changes that we have made so far, right? It's to
Right.
now, we already are in those positions of power. And so, I think we do have to push through what this difficult period and we just have to not give up because we will then see another period of progress at some point.
Yeah. The ebbs and flows of it.
Yeah,
Ugh, I know. I'm a news junkie, but even I've had to kind of hit the brakes on some of it because
I know.
sometimes it's just like this is our reality right now as a woman living in this society.
Mm.
I want to understand from the data that you have compiled and within negotiation, parenthood, the workplace, what do you think along the lines of what we're talking about, what gives you hope?
That is such a great question. And I think what gives me hope, which is going to be cynical, I'm sorry, but what gives me hope is that I actually think making things work for women is good for companies' bottom line.
Mhm.
So I'm not going to be hopeful that companies are just going to be like, magnanimously, we're going to try to make things better for women. What gives me hope is that I think they can't afford not to.
Right.
Because they can't afford, now that women go to college and are starting to go to graduate school at higher rates than men, they can't afford to give up on more than 50% of the educated workforce, right? And
Mhm.
it's very expensive to have almost parity at entry level positions and then just be bleeding those women as you get up to those higher level jobs and those C-suite jobs, right? So I think that firms are going to kind of have no choice but to make those investments. I also pointed a study that I have where we randomized names and we also randomized GPAs on resumes. And what we showed is that firms would hire a white man. They rated a white man with a 3.74 GPA equivalent to a female or minority candidate with a 4.0 GPA, with everything held constant. So that means, of course, that they would take a white man with a 3.76 or 3.78 over the female or minority with a 4.0. Well, what that means is you're actually hiring somebody worse, right? That's not meritocracy. And so, learning how to do this better, learning how to debias your processes, learning how to actually recognize talent and let less of the extraneous information we take in from the world around us that programs our brains to be like, this man seems like he'd be a good software programmer, right? Learning to do that is actually going to bring us closer to meritocracy. It's going to bring in more talent. It's going to bring in more innovation. And so the firms that do it are going to win. And that's going to be a competitive pressure on the entire ecosystem. So that's where I'm getting my hope from.
Yeah,
Practical hope, I would say.
even if it's just a little bit, it's what we need right now. It's interesting that you mentioned about debiasing these processes. One of the things that I'm leading tomorrow, and I did last week at the company that I'm working with right now, is leading a hiring manager training for all of our hiring managers. And the thing that we talk a lot about is behavioral based interviewing and how to create a structured process that provides an equal experience across the playing field for all candidates. And I also in a lot of the roles that I've worked with in my career, especially in a sales role, of hiring salespeople, it's always like, "Can I have a beer after work with this person?" I was like, "No, that's not how we're
It's
supposed to be measuring
A
people."
100%. We used to call it the airport test in consulting, and they would say, "Do I want to be stuck in an airport with a delayed flight with this person?" And I was like, "Frat bro, you want to be stuck in an airport with a frat bro. That's not how we're going to hire her because that just means we're going to keep reproducing a workplace that looks like what a workplace looks like right now, and that's not hiring the best talent."
No, no. I'm like, "So you're measuring somebody on a vibe check. Cool, cool."
Yes, and vibes are biased.
Oh my gosh. Um, I imagine well, I can only imagine what it's like in your classroom. What do you how does this information come across to your students, and how do they receive it?
Well, I find my students, because I teach MBA students, and it's really
Mhm,
interesting because I also teach undergrads, and I really see the difference, right? That the MBA students are like in the thick of it, they've lived it, and versus the undergrads are still kind of hopeful about what that's going to look like. And I was very much in that position too, where I'm like, I'm going to have a really equal marriage, or I'm not going to be discriminated against in my career. But my MBA students, they've lived it, they're negotiating this in their relationships, they're negotiating this in their careers. And so seeing the data really helps them make sense of it all. But I
mhm,
think another place that I get hope from is that I have such good conversations with men, with the male students, and just more broadly, as I put the book out there, as I put my op eds out there, such good conversations with men about this who I do think want to be part of the solution and do want to change, but in some cases just didn't realize how bad the problem really was, right? One of the data points I point to is that a lot of dads think that they're doing way more because parenting time has increased for everybody across a generation.
mhm.
But because mom's time has increased more, the gender gap in the household has actually gotten wider instead of narrower. And when I show that to men who think of themselves as really involved dads, they're like, wow, I had no idea because they were saying, I compare myself to my dad and I read my kid a bedtime story or I dropped him off at school. My dad never did that. And not realizing that their wives' time had increased even more. So I think that I also get hope from that, from the fact that I do think that there are men who really want to be part of the solution and we have to arm them with the data.
Yeah. They have those aha moments. It tells the story. I would love to understand, you've done a lot of different research studies. What's probably and with creative setups, what do you think would probably be maybe the wildest or most creative that you've done?
Oh, I love that question. I think one of my favorite projects that did have a very complicated setup was that we taught eighth grade girls in Zambia to negotiate. And they were negotiating with their parents and negotiating with partners, with their parents to be allowed to stay in school because it costs money. And so a lot of the parents would say, we'd rather pay for the boy to go to school because you're just going to go off and get married. But the girls really had to demonstrate to say, like, no, if you invest in me, I will invest in this family. Like, I will, there could be like a win-win solution. And so we really brought like a business school negotiation curriculum that is focused on some of those win-win solutions. And as I talked about in my study about gender and negotiation, like that's some of the strength that women bring is that collaborative, like how do we make sure the deal gets done instead of just making sure I get the better deal?
Mhm.
And we brought that to eighth grade girls in Zambia. And what we saw is that they stayed in school for longer. They were more likely to graduate high school. And now we've gone back 10 years later because we did this when they were 13 years old. And when we last went back, they were on average 23 years old. And these girls got married later. They were less likely to have HIV. They were more likely to go to college. So there was a tremendous impact even a decade later. And so that's been one of the projects I've been most proud to get to do, where you can really see that impact from a pretty small intervention where, we did 6 sessions with them, teaching them
Mm.
how to negotiate. But, our premise was, if this is so valuable that people are paying hundreds of thousands of dollars to learn it in business school, what kind of impact can it make in some place where people are, sort of very under resourced?
Yeah, that's incredible. And I guess on the flip side of that, is there a study that perhaps maybe didn't go as you expected?
Oh, such a good question. And there always are, right? There's lots of false starts in research, and there's always lots of surprising data. And like I told you with that negotiation project, I started it with one research design, but when I reviewed the literature, I was like, wait a minute, there's not even any evidence that men are actually better negotiators. So how do I test that and kind of test what I was originally planning to test?
Mhm.
But I would say also, when I looked at the time use data, um, in this paper that I call Winning the Bread and Baking It Too, which shows that, women are breadwinners and they're also still doing the home production load. I had a hypothesis that said the problem is that women are kind of too productive in these home production roles. And so they might have what economists call a comparative advantage in home production, even when they're the higher earner. And I
Mhm.
thought that that might be the explanation. And what I found in the data did not support that, because even when men become unemployed, he's still not actually taking on his fair share of the housework. And so it didn't come down to productivity or ability. It really seemed like it came down to those gender roles. And in that
Mhm.
data, I also found something surprising, which was borne out in my own life too, which was that what I see is that when couples divorce, and again, couples who divorce are marriages that aren't working, so you have to keep that in mind. But when couples divorce, women's time cooking and cleaning goes down, and men's time cooking and cleaning goes up. And that aligned with my experience, where I was so scared to be a single mom because I said, this is going to be so hard. It's already so hard to juggle it. What about, being a single mom, just being one set of hands? And I had a friend who said, Corinne, you think it's going to get harder? It's going to get easier, because you don't realize that that person in a marriage that isn't working is not sharing the load. They are actually creating the load. You're doing some of that cooking and cleaning for them. And so when you remove that person from the household, you actually gain more than you lose. And that was so shocking for me. And it's such a warning to the men out there, right? Who are listening to this, and even if you're feeling defensive, to just understand that if you want to invest in the long term health of your marriage, you need to be taking more things off of your wife's plate than you're putting onto it. Yes, in a marriage and a good relationship, we both help each other out, we both do things for each other, but it needs to be that you are filling her cup at the same time as she's taking care of the household, or you're going to end up being one of those statistics where the men figure out where the broom is when she's out of the household. We see their time go up. So if you don't want to be that statistic, make sure you're taking more off her plate than you're putting on it.
The mental load.
Yeah. Yep.
I would love to understand from somebody who is very data driven, and research based focused. How do you disseminate that information to people who might not? It's like, I understand data is important and it drives a lot of decisions, but I don't understand the data. How do you disseminate that information to people who aren't data driven?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I pair it with storytelling, right? So it's not just going to be that you have to understand the graphs or the charts, right? I'm able to make it tangible in terms of, this is a story that you might have seen in your own life. And so, just the way I just described, right, where I have a graph that shows, women's time goes down after divorce and men's time goes up. But that's relatable when you actually think about stories of your friends. And I think that's how all of us process information. I had this one paper that I did showing that when Israel made IVF free, it was one of the first countries to make IVF free. And I showed that women delayed marriage and they got more education, because young women knew that it was going to give them more time to make some of the investments that they wanted to make. And I got so much pushback from men when I presented it, who would say, Well, these women aren't doing the math on how many fertile years they're going to have because they have access to IVF. So, do you really believe that they're taking this into account when they're 22 and deciding whether to go to college, or 25 and deciding whether to go to graduate school? And they said they're not doing the math. They're hearing the stories. They're seeing the success stories. They're seeing, oh, my aunt is 35 and just used IVF to get pregnant. Or this woman who was 40 and had struggled with fertility is on the news because she just gave birth to twins, right? And then those stories become the data that we use to make decisions. So when she's thinking, is it realistic for me to still have kids after I get this graduate degree? She's using those stories to do that calculation, right? And that's how we all update our beliefs, is from the information from the world around us. And I think it so often does come through those stories. And so I always try to pair the data with the stories, because at the end of the day, the data is stories. It's the aggregation of stories that, every single couple in my data set is a story. It's a marriage. And so the data just aggregates that up.
Yeah, I that is well perfectly said. I do a lot of hiring for research and insights, and so I'm always on the lookout for somebody who has those core competency skills of being able to look at the data, but also then be able to tell the story around that data to stakeholders and whoever they might need to disseminate that information to. Um, I want to talk about just going back to you mentioned Israel and IVF. Um, I want to kind of pivot back to motherhood for a moment and women in the workplace who feel that they necessarily might not have a choice and that they have to step out of the workplace. How do you think that just kind of a woman should be showing up to the table at a negotiation when it comes to things like making sure parental leave is included? What are some questions that you think a woman should ask when they are in that job process?
So, one of the things I want you to ask is a question for yourself. It's not necessarily for the employer. I want you to look at women in that job, fast forward 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, and I want you to see what their lives look like. And then I want you to ask if that aligns with your values, because we all have our own utility functions. And so some people might say, super hard charging career woman, I want to be, make partner by the time I'm 40, or I want to be the COO, right? So by all means, then look for those career paths. But if you're saying, I know I want to have a family and I know I want to balance work and family life, and then you look and every single managing director is a man with a stay at home wife, that's sending you a message about whether that's possible in this firm. Or all the women who are in those roles are women who chose not to have children, again, sending you a message. Or they never see their children and they have 5 nannies, right? So you've got to kind of fast forward and say, where is this career path taking me? And what I want you to think about is that when you're investing in your career, when you're leaning in, I want you to be asking for what? What am I hoping to achieve with this? What you should be trying to achieve is a better deal for yourself in the future. That's what you should be leaning in for. I talk about your job as a technology that converts your time into money. You put your time in and you get money back. And hopefully you get some fulfillment and you get some, relationships and other things that are meaningful to you. But fundamentally, when I ask women to picture, if you were independently wealthy, how would you spend your time? Even the women who say, I love my job, they say, yeah, but I would do that for 10 hours a week or 15 hours a week. I wouldn't do it
Yeah.
for 60 hours a week, right? Your job is not who you are. It is not what you're maximizing in life. You're maximizing what economists call utility, which is your joy and your fulfillment. And your job is a tool, it's a means to an end to get it. So when you're
Mhm.
making career investments, the goal should be upgrading your money machine so that when you hit what I call the squeeze, which is when you have young kids at home and you're expected to invest in your career, and maybe your parents are aging at the same time, you can put less of your time in and get more money out. So you've got to look across that career path and say, how are the investments that I'm making now setting me up to have a better time to money conversion ratio later in life? But that's also a good way to think about it, because it's also an important message for the young women who are going on Instagram and seeing these like soft life videos. And they're like, I just want to enjoy my life now. I don't want to work too hard, right? Sometimes when we work hard, again, it's making an investment in making things easier for ourselves later. And we have to remember that that future self is ourselves too. So if we get into lots of debt because we do too much Afterpay and Klarna or use too many credit cards, that's
Yeah.
going to make things harder for our future self, right? If we don't invest in our education or our career now, that's going to make things harder for our future self. And in fact, even if you think you are trad wife curious, that you might want to at some point lean out and invest in your kids and, spend more time with your family, it's still important to build your money machine so you can keep it in the back of your closet just in case, because you don't know what the future holds. And a friend of mine has a paper, Degrees Are Forever. Diamonds aren't forever, degrees are forever, right? Showing that when the divorce revolution happened, women started going to college to protect themselves because they said that way, if I get divorced, I always have that degree to fall back on, right? So you
Mhm.
want to always make sure you've built a money machine that you have in the back of your closet. It's not just divorce, it's death, it's disability, it's layoffs. You don't know what the future holds. You don't know if you can count on someone else's income. You want to make sure you've secured that ability to convert time into money for yourself.
Yeah. What about someone who maybe is at a point in their life that they didn't set themselves up earlier on? Maybe they've made whatever decision led them to a
Yeah.
place, and now they're midlife and trying to figure it out. Um, what what would you offer to somebody who might be like, "What do I do now? Feel like
Yeah,
I've."
great
Yeah.
question. I think you have to say, what are my goals for converting my time into money? What do I need from a career? And that's the big picture goal. And then what are the small steps that I need to take to get there, right? So sometimes that means being practical, right? I know a lot of friends who invested in one career path because they loved it, because it was their passion. But when they had kids, they said, look, I have to put way too much of time into that and I don't get enough money in return. I actually need something more practical. And some of those women went back to school to pursue healthcare degrees because they said this is a field where I can clock in and clock out and then I get paid, right? And so for I one of my friends, it was becoming a massage therapist at a hospital. For another friend, it was going into nursing. Another friend, it was becoming a midwife, because they said this field worked better for what my lifestyle is, right? So I think there's ways to find that better time to money conversion, even if you are later in your career, but you have to be laser focused on what do I want to get out of my job at that point. And so sometimes that might mean, look, I'm going to get my fulfillment someplace else. I'm going to meet my passion someplace else. I'm going to volunteer in my community. What I need for my job is for it to be practical. I need it to convert my time into money. Where am I getting a good deal on that? But I have lots of strategies in the book for saying, here's where I am and here's what I need. How do I chart out a path to that change?
Mhm. I love that. I wanna go back to your students for a moment, and this world that we live in that is so social media focused and, um, I this idea of kind of what you see as with a lot of the influencers out there, and this life that's what you see in front of the camera isn't really what you see behind the camera. Do you have students, and I guess I'm speaking specifically to your undergrad students who are just like, "No, I'm gonna get rich because I'm gonna be an influencer, or I'm gonna be this or that."
Or marry a rich husband. There's also that, right? Yeah.
True. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I do think that it's hard. Like, I talk about the influencer thing also just being hard because it also gives us unrealistic expectations of what's possible, because we think, oh, I should look like that. My outfits should look like that. My food should look like that. My house should look like that. And it's like, that's that woman's full time job. Like, you're every bit as good at your job as she is at cutting shapes out of her kids' sandwiches for lunch, right? Or like having her house look beautiful or doing her makeup. But that's not your job. And if you try to chase those things, one, you're going to get into credit card debt, right? And two, you're just going to be unhappy because you actually also need a separate career. So, yes, I do worry a lot about young people getting messages from social media. And I think we need to understand that the influencer game is kind of like a lottery. It's like the people who you see who are famous, they're like the LeBron James of influencing, right? They have that secret sauce. They are the top, not just 1%, but 0.1% of the influencer population. And for that, there are so many other people who are on that grind, who are trying to make it happen where they are not getting the financial returns. So, I would say in general, to keep in mind that what you get paid for on the labor market is what economists call your human capital, which is your skills and your abilities, right? And so if you say, I'm going to get rich being an influencer, ask, am I bringing unique human capital to the table there? LeBron James has basketball human capital because he's really good at basketball, right? But if what you're doing is what a lot of other people can do, if it's not unique skills and abilities, you're not actually going to command that much of an income for doing it. Versus if you get your education and there's only so many people who have a law degree or so many people who have a medical degree, you're actually going to command a higher premium. So I just think keeping in mind, typically what you get paid on the labor market is proportional to your human capital. How are you investing in building your human capital? Because that's what you're going to get paid for.
Hmm. I love that. What what would you say when you're taught when if somebody says to you, "Okay, well, how do I know what my human capital is?" What are there tips that you offer of like, well, let's break it down to again, LeBron James being example. He's got basketball. Like what do you kind of what stock do you put into human capital?
Well, I think the thing there is that very little of it is innate, right? LeBron James' talent, there was some talent that was innate, but then he invested in building that human capital, right? And so
Mhm.
it's your human capital is going to be what you invest in building. And in most cases, you don't get a high return for something that you haven't invested in. It's like I am able to write a book about economics right now because I have spent 20 years pursuing that career and establishing my expertise in that field. So I think that is what we should be communicating to young people is that, it's not just about your skills or your talents, it's about the work that you put in. And you get to choose to develop your human capital in an area that makes sense for you. And when you're choosing where to make those investments, as I said, I think it's good to look at where does that take me on a career path that I want to go? So, where am
Mhm.
I making investments that are leading me to something that's going to support my life at all these different phases? And not to say you have to have everything mapped out. I certainly did not. When I started my career, I had double majored as an economist and I had done this minor in journalism because I really wanted to be a writer. But then I realized that writers did not make any money, that their parents were paying their rent. By and large, the young people, like the young magazine writers living in New York City, okay, they were not affording that apartment on their own.
No.
And so I interviewed for consulting jobs because consulting jobs paid a lot more and I needed to pay off my student loans. So I made a choice that was very practical. But it turned out that consulting was really excellent preparation for any kind of future career because I got to be exposed to a lot of different industries. I got to build a lot of relationships with people that I still, do work with, right? So it set me up for that next step. And so I think if you don't have the whole arc mapped out, you want to take a next step in your career that builds your human capital, that gives you transferable and durable skills that are going to help you in whatever you do next, right? You want to find those skills that are evergreen, that people are always going to need: communication, leadership, project management. And when you invest in those skills, they're going to be transferable, even if later you decide, hey, it's this industry I think is a better fit for me, or it's this other area. So make your next right step that sets you up to give you as many options and as many skills for that next decision point as possible.
Amazing. I want to ask you just with technology and AI and I think a lot of people are afraid of losing the talent and the hard work that they've built
Yes, yes.
with all of the AI and where that's going to go. Um, are you seeing that as a potential gap for people yet?
Yes, I think that AI is challenging the way we think about a career arc, the way we think about some of these investments, because some people are saying, well, I invested my human capital as a software engineer, and now it turns out that ChatGPT can do it for me. I think
Mhm.
firms are making a big mistake because what we're finding out is that AI is very good at replacing entry level employees, and AI is very bad at replacing more senior level employees. But the problem is, if you don't hire the entry level software programmers, you don't have the senior level software programmers later. So I think this is going to come back to bite firms in the butt a lot. But that's what I mean by transferable and durable skills is you want to set yourself up the same way in a marriage. You want to set yourself up for, I don't know what the future holds. So I need to be set up to say, do I have the skills in case I get divorced, in case my husband loses his job, right? You want to be set up for those different scenarios. In a career, you want to think about that as well. You want to say, I want to have durable skills that are going to be valuable no matter how this industry evolves in the future, that are going to be valuable no matter what the tariffs are, no matter what AI technology is, right? And
Yes.
that's where I do think for people to understand that interpersonal skills of communication and leadership are fundamentally skills that technology is not going to replace. And so when you invest in developing those skills, when you invest in developing thinking and leadership skills, and therefore really investing in your education and not trying to outsource your education to ChatGPT, because ChatGPT cannot learn for you, right? That it will make you competitive in the job market, no matter what the future holds.
Amazing. Well, I have 2 more questions for you, and one being, um, obviously you've written your books, you're continuing to do your research. What is next for you? What will you be working on next?
Such a good question. And the most exciting part of this journey of putting my research out there in this book is that I'm having conversations with firms and with leaders that I didn't get to have before. Because, when I write a paper and it's in an academic journal, even though that's exciting for me and for my field, not very many people read academic journals. But, since publishing the book, now I can write an op ed in the New York Times and a lot more people read that. And so what I'm so excited about is I'm starting to see firms be really interested in putting some of the research into practice. And
Mhm.
that is what lights my fire. That's what motivates me because that's how it's ultimately going to impact people's lives. So I am super excited about this next chapter about continuing to get this data out there to women who it can help and to firms that actually want to make evidence based decisions.
That's amazing, and isn't it interesting how your education kind of came full circle where you started out with journalism and economics, and here you are?
It's so true, and I've reflected on that, but I was like, if you asked nine-year-old me what I wanted to be when I grew up, I would have always said a writer, and, like, here I am, that now I get to be a writer, I get to communicate with people, but I get to communicate with people about the substance of what I've poured the rest of my career into, which was, developing that data and developing that expertise, so I really got to combine everything together.
That is incredible. I had a conversation with a recent college graduate who's trying to figure out her career, and um, she was just like, how did you get there?" And I said, I remember sitting in class where people would say, kind of just fell into this,
Yeah,
or where, this path, it's never just linear.
it isn't.
Yeah, it's
Yeah, and I talk
incredible.
about this woman named Carrie Ann Rockamore who I've taken a lot of inspiration from, who has this concept of your career as a book with many chapters. That it isn't a linear path. It's what does this chapter hold? And so there's going to be points in your life where you'll get to introduce a plot twist. You'll get to take a turn, right? And that's how it has been for me, right? Getting to be a writer and getting to kind of have that dream fulfilled later in my career. So I think just remembering that we don't need one chapter to do everything. Your goal is, what am I building? What am I putting in my toolkit? What am I accumulating as far as human capital that's going to help me in that next chapter?
Yeah, amazing. Oh my gosh, this is all incredible information. I really appreciate you taking some time to chat with me. And the last question that I have for you is, where can people follow and learn more about you?
Well, thanks. Well, I hope that people will get the book. It's called Having It All, and it's available wherever you get your books. And it's also on Audible because I know for me, audiobooks are how I read these days. So I hope that people will get the book. It also makes a great gift. If you are a man, you need to read this too because men are partners to women, they are managers of women, right? So this book is not just for women, it's for everybody in your lives. And you can also go to my website, CorinneLow.com. I have a lot of resources there, including a time tracking spreadsheet to try to measure the balance of labor in your household or just how you spend your own time. And there's also a workbook that goes with the book. And I'm on Instagram, Corinne Low PhD. Oh, I'm also on Substack. I have a newsletter called Feminomics, and that's just CorinneLow.substack.com.
I love that. Have you trademarked Feminomics yet?
I haven't, but it's what I've blogged under since back when I was in grad school. I blogged under the name Feminomics, and it was meant to be a play on Freakonomics. But so that's people have been able to find me there for a long time.
Amazing. Well, Dr. Lowe, thank you so much for joining me, and I really appreciate your flexibility with the timing of all of this, so thank you.
Absolutely. That was a great conversation. Thanks so much.